Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. This is Lyceum Round-Table, episode 73. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Locals, and Telegram. You can also support me on Locals, Buy Me a Coffee, and Subscribe Star. And as per usual, as time permits, we'll read Super Chats first and then other comments as they pertain to tonight's discussion. So I'm again joined by Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, Terminal Philosophy. This will be the last roundtable of the year and the last regular scheduled programming, except for the Moldbug Saturday shows, which will keep going through the holidays. But overall, I'm going to take a bit of a break this year for the rest of the 2 weeks and get ahead on next year. So what happened in 2022? I think the biggest event that happened in 2022 is, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This war in Eastern Europe, I think a lot of people could see that something was brewing ever since 2014. Didn't exactly know when it was going to spill over into a broader conflict. And I think in that war, the biggest surprise was that somehow Ukraine was able to get all of the ex-Cold War surplus from NATO and the former Eastern Bloc within a few months. I don't think anybody really was expecting they'd get all those resources from all over the world to fight the Russians. And I don't think Putin was expecting that, because he expected that, given his original opening move, a broad attack from Kiev all the way down to Crimea, was that they wouldn't be getting that support. And also he didn't have the reservists mobilized. And so, yeah, that's something that I don't think very many people expected. But they got the weapons, they got the supplies, and they were able to put up a resistance much more fiercely than anyone had expected. The other thing that's not a surprise is that move then scared other neutral countries like Sweden and Finland, who are now filing to join with NATO. Again, not a surprise there. Russia seems to be tapped out on a lot of fronts: Caucasus, Central Asia, the sort of Baltic Sea front, which where they're at, or the Black Sea front rather. The Baltic Sea, they're completely isolated, and that's probably the weakest front for Russia right now, that whole area. Domestically in the United States, I mean, obviously the midterms were kind of weak sauce. You would have thought the Republicans would have done better given the lame duck presidency of Joe Biden. But apparently this is the year of disappointment for everyone, right? Biden's the gaffing president in chief, and then the Republicans still can't seem to beat, a guy with dementia. So, I guess that's it. People, of course, are already gearing up for the 2024 election. So who knows how that's going to turn out. I'm not going to make any predictions until the end of next year. And so the other thing that we've seen, and I think this is from a serious point of view, we've seen a reorientation of the global economy and global politics away from the Atlanticist NATO Western powers. So first of all, I don't know how many people have seen the map where it's like 1990 and then 2022, and it has nations with the flags of either Russia or US or China as the world's as their leading trading partner. And so like in 1990, only like 3 or 4 nations are which China is their leading trading partner. As of 2022, it's like 3/4 of the world's nations. China is the world's largest partner. And we're seeing that reflected in foreign policy too, because the reason why the sanctions on Russia have been largely ineffectual is because most of the world isn't joining in on the sanctions. It's only Europe, the United States, and some of the Eastern Pacific countries like Japan and South Korea. China's not, India's not, the Middle East is not. Africa certainly is not, because they want to buy that Ukrainian grain. And South America's not. And I think the real big picture takeaway is that there's a pivot away from the Western Anglo-Atlanticist power structure to a more traditional way the world worked, where China was the world's largest economy. As we've mentioned in previous episodes, that's not news. China historically has always been the world's largest economy. It's only that the United States in the modern age is it's an outlier of world history. And then domestically, what we've seen is that the disaster of outsourcing jobs with globalism is really biting America in the ass, because we can't bring jobs back fast enough. The whole microchip, computer processing chip crisis in the South China Sea with Taiwan, building of factories in the United States, which won't be finished until 2025, and they won't be up to full production until probably like 2030. This is not, there's not enough time to get all that up to speed before the world unravels even more. And so I think that that's like the big picture that I'll have. So what is your big picture take, Keith, on 2022?
Well, I've been writing for over 20 years, where I made predictions about the turn of events that were likely to happen in the future. And this year, a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about for years has, to a large degree, come into fruition. For instance, if you go and you read an article that I wrote called "Philosophical Anarchism and the Death of Empire," you can forget about the first part of that for the moment. Just focus on the death of empire part. I wrote that in 2003, and it's available on attackthesystem.com. And in there, I laid out a series of predictions about the future geopolitical order. And that article was written at the height of the Iraq War. It was the same year. The war had already started when I wrote it, the Iraq War. And I predicted that American power would eventually recede due to overextension, because in that time period, the Americans were going around invading different countries and blowing whatever political capital they had. And I thought that there would be a backlash against that worldwide, as well as domestically, and that eventually the United States would start to recede in influence internationally. And I predicted that Europe would become more assertive in response, and that Asia would become more important, and that the BRICS countries would also become more self-assertive, along with the Latin American countries. And we see virtually all of that happening nowadays. I mean, the most obvious thing is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But as Todd said, you also have the expansion of China's economic influence worldwide. India is also a rising power. You also see a number of lesser powers that are starting to become more assertive: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey. You see the Latin American countries; many of them are going their own way and resisting American influence. I mean, even those with right-wing governments like Bolsonaro during his tenure. Also, you see the increased importance of Southeast Asia due to development, places like Indonesia, Malaysia, the countries that used to be called Indochina, Vietnam, and some of those. So the distribution of power worldwide, political and economic power, is becoming more dispersed. And we're moving towards a geopolitical order that's kind of like what we had in the year 1900, where you didn't have a single hegemon like the United States, or even a bipolar set of hegemons like in the Cold War. Instead, you had multiple major powers that each had their own realms of influence. And back then, Britain was the largest back then, but also you had Russia, Japan, France, the other European colonial powers, and America was a rising power. And we're moving back towards a situation like that nowadays. And I think the situation with Russia and Ukraine really had the effect of escalating that dramatically, because, like Todd said, you saw how the geopolitical alignments broke down. You saw the West going out of their way to impose sanctions on Russia, and the rest of the world said, well, sorry, but we're not participating, including staunch American allies in places like the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, Israel, Pakistan. None of those places were actually participating in the sanctions on Russia. So that certainly shows that the United States and then the West generally has, I think their level of influence and power and their reach is being reduced. But one thing parallel to that I think is interesting is something that happened in domestic American politics. There's another essay that I wrote back in around 2003. I don't remember the year, but around the same time as the other article I was mentioning, where I predicted that in the future you would see a political current emerge in the United States that was moderately reformist in economic policy and moderately libertarian in social policy. And I think that with the midterm elections this year, that element in US politics showed itself. And the reason I thought that would happen was that the wealth disparities that were starting to develop in the post-NAFTA, post-neoliberal era. I thought the wider that become, the more economic opinion would move leftward. I mean, I never thought Americans would become communists or anything like that, but I did think that that would push economic opinion on economic issues leftward. And I also thought that the disdain for institutions generally would move people towards a more, broadly libertarian perspective on a lot of things. The idea of hands-off government and that kind of stuff. And we saw elements of that in the recent election, where it seems that moderate thinker, people with moderately libertarian social views or perhaps moderately reformist economic views tended to do fairly well. People that were perceived of as either far right or extremist or in some way didn't do very well. And it seems like this, what I call a purple tribe, not a red tribe that's staunchly socially conservative and, super patriotic, USA, and, and the old fusionist paradigm, Reaganite economics and all that. It's, that the purple tribe is not that, but then they're not the deep blue either. They're not for outright socialism and communism. They don't want to defund the police. They don't want to totally open the borders. They don't necessarily want to have totally unregulated abortion, and that, or they may be moderately pro-gun, but they don't want to have no gun laws at all either. So this kind of centrist, kind of reformist, kind of libertarian element seems to be emerging. So I think both of those currents that I've been predicting for about 20 years have now largely come into being.
All right, Swithun. And let's also forget 2020 is the year England has its second winter of discontent. Okay, Swithun, what are your thoughts on 2022?
Well, clearly the most important thing was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But lest us forget what that ended without a trace, which was the last 2 years of lockdowns and how everybody's going to die because of a cold. It is a perfect explanation and illustration of how whatever anybody actually cares about is a function of what the media cares about. Because the media don't care about it, people don't care about it, because it's not reported. The outpouring of patriotism for a country that wasn't your own when the start of the Ukraine war was bizarre, in which the only time I ever remember that people just put flags of foreign countries up everywhere, that somehow they're in solidarity of the country of which they know absolutely nothing. And apart from the fact that they have a blue and yellow flag, and their leader is nice because he's an actor, and Putin man bad. This also then becomes even more interesting with respect to more recently, because, well, we've now decided that lockdowns are bad, but China are doing them. So therefore, the protesters against China are freedom fighters, as opposed to domestic terrorists, which, of course, all the lockdown protesters clearly were in Western Europe and America. So I just can't help but focus on clearly the role of the media in how events are portrayed and how they are sort of and how they influence what people think about. I mean, it's absurd. Remember as well, I mean, it's kind of stopped now, but the crazy anti-Russian sentiments, so much so that Tchaikovsky, playing of Tchaikovsky's pieces in concerts was banned. Well, it wasn't banned; they were cancelled because somehow a dead Russian composer is a problem somehow. This seems so bizarre. So I mean, it's just utterly crazy. Related to this, though, with the Russian invasion is, of course, and if you mentioned it, that Britain's got a winter of discontent. As everyone may or may not know, we have lots of strikes currently going ahead. Nurses, the trains, the postal service, multiple various ones. And of course, what they all claim is that, oh no, the main reason for the inflation was the fact of, oh no, guess what? Putin man bad again. He's invaded, and then it messed up all the gas supply and stuff, and it made the prices go up, which it did to some extent. However, again, want to focus in context. The energy prices were going up massively since, well, the wholesale price of gas started going up from February 2021, from a cold snap in Europe. And then, well, basically over the last 18 months, we've seen the unsurprising results of relying on unreliable energy sources, otherwise known as solar and wind. If you had half sane grid policies, the massive energy prices that you currently have wouldn't exist, because you'd actually have cheap, reliable energy, which is kind of quite nice. As you might, it's now very cold in England as well. So I think that might, well, sorry, not getting to predictions, but not to get into predictions now, but it will be interesting to see how the environmental movements and green energy copes after a year when people could well freeze to death, which is a distinct possibility in certain areas in the UK. So my big takeaway, well, one of many, could go into other things, but just as a brief intro, my big takeaway is, again, just to focus on how important the media are in what people care about, because they do not care about it sort of independently of it. It's just whatever is focused on, people latch onto.
Okay, and now what are the news from the front with our military attaché terminal philosophy?
Well, I think I also share a very similar observation among the panel here, which is to say that the world is definitely returning to a geopolitical orientation to that of the early 20th century or pre-World War I. I think the gradual retraction of American global dominance means that regional powers are starting to fill the voids where America once occupied, whether that means in a military or trade or business sense. And Keith already covered that with the emergence of China and India. And, we also have the incoming SWIFT system, which is basically an alternative to the use of the American dollar as the dominant global currency. So we'll have to see what the repercussions of that are in the coming years. But this reemergence of the multipolar world is perhaps most apparent because of the war in Ukraine. And what was, I guess you could say, what was thought to be an economic kill shot, the sanctions imposed by the West have largely fallen short of their intended effect because Russia reorganized its trade relations with Asia and the Middle East and various nations in Africa. And it, of course, it goes without saying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is, without a doubt, the most potent event of 2022. I think most of us following the conflict were very surprised by the Ukrainian defense efforts, the impressive Ukrainian defense efforts, as well as the, I guess you could say, mediocre performance of the Russian offensive, at least in various isolated parts of the front. Of course, one of the most interesting features of this war is the Western media coverage. And there's, of course, and we've discussed this in previous episodes, but there's, of course, no mention of the 2014 coup or the ways in which NATO and the West have exacerbated the conflict in various ways. And this isn't just blind cheerleading for Putin, but you have to remember the people that are reporting on the Ukrainian war in the West are the same people who have lied to us for decades about the nature of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam and so on and so forth. I mean, these so-called journalists of these mega corporations are just these vestigial PR extensions of these corporations with fiscal interests first, and objective, honest reporting is much further down the chain. So. Yeah, the war in Ukraine certainly is interesting. There is quite an interesting focus on heavy equipment, on artillery, integrated anti-air systems. One of the more delicate aspects of the conflict is whether or not there will be continued high-tech weaponry coming in from the West, and what specific pieces of hardware. For example, will the Germans be sending Leopard 2s in the future? Will more HIMARS systems be making it to Ukraine? And of course, I don't remember if it was Frontline or a different media outlet, but much of the money and weapons that goes to Ukraine, not all of it, in fact, something like 40 to 50% of it only makes it to the front, and the rest of it ends up going onto the black market. So that's another confusing and bizarre aspect of the conflict. I think in wars decades earlier, you would see a much higher percentage of that money and hardware and ammunition and resources and logistics making it to the front lines of different conflicts. But I think I'll leave my opening comments at that. But yeah, the Ukrainian conflict is certainly the most, it's the juiciest red meat for 2022.
Switching back to the domestic affairs of 2022 in the United States, I think especially in light of the combination of the riots that occurred in 2020 and the lockdowns and the economic dislocation, I'm sort of getting the feeling that there's a sort of sense of collective exhaustion. So, for example, after the Dobbs decision, there were very little protests against the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and even though the midterm elections was pretty weak for both sides, many. I remember Nancy Pelosi said back in July when that ruling was made that we're gonna overturn all this in the midterms. There's gonna be a referendum on the Dobbs decision, and we're gonna just sweep in with a blue wave. That was the Democratic narrative. There was no wave, blue or red. I mean, both sides were sort of exaggerating their position, but I didn't see a lot of riots. Certainly, I was expecting large-scale riots, like on the size of George Floyd, and we just didn't see that. And I wonder if, in part, this is a result of just sort of collective exhaustion. I mean, a lot of people have been strung out, right? They've had the crisis with COVID, the lockdowns. There's still the ongoing climate crisis. Build Back Better, the all that stuff that they're being talked about. Then the war in Ukraine, and so I think a lot of people are getting sort of just exhausted. And this is something interesting too. A few years back, before Right Ruminations left, he was one of the original panelists on the Lyceum Round-Table. And he was telling me, I think it was like right before COVID, it's like 2018, 2019, he had a feeling that there was a sense of exhaustion in the American population. And this was due to the whole Trump era. So that's like 5 years of Trump, 2015 to 2020. Everybody's just all, full tilt, political fanaticism. And I was in agreement broadly saying, yeah, I think a lot of people are exhausted. Now, we did see mass protests in 2020, and we might still yet see mass protests in the future. I'm not saying we won't. But I do see that there is at least evidence of a large sense of, on the one hand, apathy, and on the other hand, exhaustion. And I think we can also see this in places like Canada, where people are seriously considering medical assistance in death. Which is like, well, if you had hope for the future, if you were a believer in the plan or a believer in the movement, you wouldn't take MAID. You'd go to the streets. So the fact that this is actually viable, people are actually signing up for this, knowing that it's the end, that they're going to die if they do this. I think it shows in the Western world there's this tremendous exhaustion. Keith, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think everyone has raised some interesting points. To piggyback on something Swithun said, I totally agree that people seem to get worked up about whatever the media tells them they need to be worked up about at any one time. It's like the famous concept from 1984, Orwell's 1984, the 2 minutes of hate. Although I guess in our case, it would be the 2 months of hate or whatever. But it seems like there's been this series of things that the media is saying everybody needs to be upset about. And people, a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people take it to heart. For some years, it was just Donald Trump. Whatever Donald Trump did is the worst thing in history. You had Russiagate, you had all of that. And then after that, it was the we need to. It was wearing masks and all the usual stuff, and then it was the George Floyd thing, Black Lives Matter, and then it was vaccinations, and you're not a true human being if you're not vaccinated. And then there was Ukraine. No, then there was January 6th. Then there was Ukraine. So you had all this series of events where one after the other, the media is constantly promoting hysteria over the latest, whatever to happen. And it is interesting how you have true believers in all this. Like you have people that, whenever it's June comes around, they've got their rainbow flags up everywhere, and then they've got their BLM banners, and they've got the Ukraine flags, and they pride themselves on having been vaccinated, whatever is the issue at the moment. And I do think that people wouldn't be doing that if they weren't told that's what they're supposed to do. Although I see the same thing among the Red tribe as well. Like they do whatever Fox News tells them they need to be upset about. And parallel to that, like Todd was saying, as far as people becoming exhausted, I think the reason we had the riots over the George Floyd thing was because of the pandemic and the pandemic lockdowns. I don't think we would have had those if the lockdowns hadn't have happened. If during that time people were going to work and going to school and going to the movies and going to ball games and going to bars and doing all the stuff they really want to do, and they weren't hurting economically, and they didn't feel like they were in jail, they probably wouldn't have been so worked up about George Floyd. I think George Floyd was just sort of a spark that lit the inferno. In fact, I know when that happened, I knew a guy who at one point had been a prison guard, and he said, "Yeah, this is just what happens in prison. Once inmates have been under lockdown for a while, they go nuts. It's like you try to discipline them by putting them on lockdown, and then they just get worse." And that's exactly what happened in 2020. And as far as whether people are burnt out now, I think there's some truth to that. I think a lot of people are. I think a lot of people are like, okay, we've heard enough of all this back and forth, all this conflict. I mean, I know people who say that all the time. Like people just get too worked up about this stuff. As to why there were not riots over the Dobbs decision, well, to some degree there were. I mean, not on the level of George Floyd, but you did have vandalisms that took place of those crisis pregnancy facilities where they're sort of like reverse abortion clinics, whatever. They tell you shouldn't have an abortion, and then they also had a assassination attempt of one of the Supreme Court justices. They actually found a guy that was going to his house to try to shoot him or something like that. So some of those kinds of things did happen, but it's true you didn't see the massive protest and rioting that you saw over the George Floyd incident. I think the reason for it is that people were over that at that point, like, now I'll pass on this one. Already seen this movie once. And although if it may be that some other outrage or supposed outrage will come along in the future and to trigger another wave of rioting, but I tend to think that what happened in 2020 was a unique combination of circumstances. It was the pandemic, the lockdowns, the economic effects of all that, combined with the George Floyd incident and the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement had been hyping that for a while, and then you had people on the other side getting upset about for or against Trump or whatever. So I think that's probably that unique combination of circumstances didn't repeat itself this year. So that's probably why it was a somewhat calmer year. I mean, relatively speaking.
All right, Swithun. So winner of discontent, Richard III, Margaret Thatcher, and now Sunak. England's not having it good right now.
No, it's not. Inflation's running, I'm not sure what it is in the US, under the RPI is running about 14%. And the unions are unsurprisingly upset because they've been offered a 3% pay rise when there's inflation of 14%, which kind of looks like a big real wage cut. So yes, it's not going hugely well for Sunak, but what I'd never seen this happen before. I don't know if it's happened in America. They have literally, they have figuratively thrown in the towel. There are loads of Tory MPs who are just not going to bother contesting the next election because the Tories are going to be completely massacred in the election. As I mentioned with the one a couple of weeks ago, I think I've made my views reasonably clear. But what I think is interesting that 2022 shows in England is that it was been obvious before, but it seems clear that the politicians do not necessarily care about being re-elected. The Tories have engaged in policies which will almost certainly make them lose more heavily than they otherwise would. But the policy they have undertaken will guarantee them very good jobs when they leave Parliament, because all their financier friends will be happy, because they're the ones who are over the head in loads of debt and government bonds, etc. So they're going to be nice and safe. But again, with the media, nobody seems to be pointing this out. It's not as if like, oh yeah, Jeremy Hunt's he just realized he's going to do it in the interest of the country after being a career politician for almost the entirety. I remember him, well, maybe his entire life, but he's been a career politician for a long time and involved in massive cock-ups and other things. But somehow he's doing this for the good of the country. Just seems deeply implausible. Yet none of the mainstream media of any influence seem to be going, hang on, this makes no sense.
But isn't Mike Lynch of the England rail workers sort of pointing out the money power? I heard an interview recently where he said that Westminster's just supporting the wealthy.
Oh well, yes, that's true. Yeah, he would say that. I mean, that's a typical union point. But what I think he isn't pointing out, which is the point I'm trying to make, is that the Tories are engaging in policies which will actively harm their electoral chances. It is not just that, oh, well, if we do this, we'll kind of be kept good by media coverage or whatever, so we can win. So the idea that they're doing things so that they can win the next election is completely implausible. And again, with the media focus, the one thing that the media don't really seem to focus on is to, oh, why might the economy doing badly? I mean, I've mentioned like the utterly insane energy policy. But then there's also the fact that, well, I wonder if the money supply increased a lot in the last couple of years. I wonder if that happened and the government ran a massive deficit, the biggest one outside water. No, that can't be anything to do with that. Putin man bad. Again, and so again with the unions, I'm agnostic with the unions. I kind of don't care to a large extent. I can understand why they're doing it. But again, the unions are the people who would have gone, no, we can't go back to work. It's not safe. Not safe. Can't go back to work. And now they're complaining that their wages are going down, part of the action that they were supporting 18 months ago. So I kind of was like, yeah. But what is going to happen? I mean, the government will stay where it is. I can't see it being toppled in that sense. I don't see a snap election because I think the Tories just know they're going to lose anyway. So they'll stay in power as long as they can until they need to. But yeah, whether the lights do go out, they could well. I mean, there've been reports from the National Grid that could happen. But with protesters, interestingly, since in the UK, the only relatively well publicised protests have been Just Stop Oil and other climate-related protests, which again, like the BLM protests, are effectively tacitly endorsed. They just, it's like, oh no, they're on the motorway, you have to close it and wait for them to come down, and other things like this, and all the tie themselves. And again, it's just obvious that that they are not being treated like, I don't know, let's suppose some nationalists were going to complain about immigration by standing on gantries on motorways. I mean, they'd be down in an instant. That would be ridiculous. Oh, with that as well, which you may not be aware of, there are most of the well, not most, but loads of hotels in England now are being housed alleged refugees, and there are absolutely loads of them. Even the one in my hometown is now a refugee centre. And they're just being sent everywhere. But the British government is showing its great strength in this, in that they are going to deport a foreign criminal. He is called Boris Becker, who apparently is so dangerous that he needs to be deported after lying to something to do with his bankruptcy. But apparently all the Albanians who otherwise probably running drugs and gangs and other things like that, no, they're probably refugees. But Boris Becker, the tennis player and tennis coach, somehow is so bad that he's going to go back to Germany. So that gives you a flavour of how fun it is to be over here.
All right, terminal philosopher.
Right. Well, I strongly agree with the idea that not only Americans, but working and average people everywhere are simply worn out and demoralized by the political and economic happenings of the last 5 to 10 years. I think Keith covered the political aspects of this, I guess you could call it an American national malaise very well. I think one other aspect I'd like to add to that is the uniquely time-consuming conditions of work life in America. I believe that it's still the case that Americans work longer hours than most industrialized modern nations. I think we're simply overworked, and the money that we make doesn't go nearly as far as it did decades earlier. Many people in my generation have no hope of ever owning a home or land in their life. And this is sort of exacerbated by the example of BlackRock, where they're buying up many homes, and it's just turning American suburban life into a renter's society. This almost has intimations of Klaus Schwab's "you'll own nothing and like it" type of a slogan, where, you know, you might own a car and you might own books and video games and streaming service accounts, but that's about as far as it'll go for many people. And I think, you know, productivity, especially in the United States, has gone very high since the 1970s, but the wages haven't matched that since the late 70s. And so I think this adds very much to the demoralization of public life in America. You know, you simply have to work your butt off. And then, you know, depending on what your political orientation is, you're told constantly by the pro wrestling model of the corporate media that you're supposed to be frustrated by this or that. And so it feels, to quote Sam Hyde, it feels like a frantic, schizophrenic zeitgeist that you just simply can't escape. And so I think, you know, perhaps that's not the main point, but because I think that Keith already covered the political aspects really well on this. But I think simply just having to work your butt off all the time, well over 40 hours a week, that makes things difficult. And it's unfortunate that, you know, you have to spend the best years of your life being overworked when you know, that potentially that could be spent on things more intellectual or creative or literary or philosophically or in any other sense. But I think that's a big aspect of why people are so demoralized. That is usually that I think that point usually lives in the shadow of the political conditions of the modern day. So yeah.
All right. So now we'll move into predictions for 2023. So we'll divide that into two categories: national and then global. And so for global, I think what we can see is that the BRICS alliance, of which China is the core member, is probably going to gain more steam. See, this is why China is so uniquely different than the other threats to the Atlantic power structure. If you look at Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, he basically makes a very simple argument that in the modern age, whoever has the largest GDP and productive capacity wins wars. So it's Britain, then it's the United States. And, well, even before that, it was the Dutch. They invented, you know, global trade, and so they beat the English twice in naval campaigns. And then it was the English, and then it was the Americans. Well, by all of those metrics, it's China now. China is the world's largest producer of goods and services. It's the largest trading partner of most of the world's nations. You know, Germany in the two world wars, Japan in World War II, Russia in the Cold War, didn't really have that kind of clout. In fact, Russia pursued autarky and was kind of isolated in its own Eastern Bloc, and Germany and Japan didn't really have a chance to grow yet, stretch their legs. But China has. And I think in a lot of regards, China has a strategy that can work to reverse the results of Columbus by having reviving the Silk Road and then making Asia the economic hub that it used to be. And so China really doesn't have to act yet. It can just, be the man moving the chess pieces while everybody else is watching Putin. And of course, I think you could see something like a Lend-Lease deal where like China sells supplies to Russia for access to bases, the same way the U.S. did with Britain. And I think, how Ukraine goes, I still think, as given Russia's reverses thus far, Russia still has, in the long run, a winning chance because of its manpower reserves. It has about 50,000 tanks in reserve and about 50,000 armored fighting vehicles in reserve. They've only been burned. I mean, this is like just a, third degree burn here, what they've suffered on the battlefield. They can go through a lot more resources than NATO can. And of course, China can sell supplies as well. So that's sort of a broad prediction for the world. We'll also probably see more energy wars. I know there's supposed to be water wars in the Caucasus. There's supposed to be conflict over oil in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia. If that pans out in 2023, I wouldn't be surprised. Domestically in the United States, I think the Biden administration will just continue to bumble along and screw things up more. That's just sort of a given, and we'll have to wait till 2024 to see what that actually means for the Biden administration. And as far as, I think we can see more dispirited people, more burnout, but also with the rise of, commodity prices, decline, stagnant wages and gas prices, we probably will see more unrest. I don't necessarily know what that would look like, if it's going to be like on the streets or if it's going to be like, edgy financiers, like with GameStop stock, how they were trying to like mess with the market there. I don't know what way this resistance is going to come, but I do think there's this crisis point. I mean, you've said before, Keith, when like 30 or 40% of your income goes to buying groceries, that's when a revolution happens. We are converging on that point rapidly. I'm not saying it's going to happen in 2023, but everything is accelerating in that direction. So I wouldn't be surprised if it happens that year, next year, the year after. So Keith Preston, 2023 predictions.
Well, as the big thing worldwide is the question of where the war in Ukraine is going to go. Based on past wars of a similar nature, I predict that war is probably going to last for a long time, like the Soviet war in Afghanistan or like the American wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I don't really see Russia packing up and going home anytime soon. And the people that are really pulling the strings in the West are adamant about not having any negotiations with Russia. That's the American position. That's the British position. That's the position of all the Eastern European and Baltic countries. It's obviously Ukraine's position. Now the Germans and the French have a more moderate position, but I think that their point of view is probably not going to win out. So the big question is, how far is that war going to go? How intense is it going to get? How is it going to spread into other countries? Is it going to involve other powers? I suspect that like past wars, it's probably not going to go so far as to involve a literal superpower confrontation. For instance, the Soviet war in Afghanistan was one where the Americans were zealously backing the anti-Soviet insurgents like they're doing in Ukraine, but it didn't actually involve using American troops because that would have been a direct military engagement with the Soviet Union. And I suspect that that's probably the way that Ukraine is going to be managed by the West. They're going to continue to fuel the anti-Russian insurgency in Ukraine without getting directly involved militarily. And this is probably something that will go on for quite some time, probably a good number of years. And it's going to be interesting to see what comes at the end of that as well. We're going to get like an Azov Taliban in Ukraine or something like that. And then parallel to that internationally, I think that we're going to see the continued expansion of multipolarity because the United States is already farming out a lot of its global functions to other powers. That's what the Quad is about in Asia, and it's also what the Abraham Accords was about in the Middle East. It was the reason that Trump turned the Syrian war over to Erdogan. The United States seems to be receding and is outsourcing some of these kinds of functions to allies and client states. So we'll probably see the continued slow growth of multipolarity. Domestically, a lot of economists are predicting a recession, that a major recession is going to happen within the next year or two. I think that's certainly possible, particularly if the Fed continues to jack up interest rates in order to try to get inflation under control. You have this issue where the higher you raise interest rates, the higher unemployment rates are. But then the lower you raise them, the more you lower them, the more you're going to have inflation. So I think that they're trying to find out what direction they want to go with that. But yeah, as the cost of living increase, I think you're going to find a lot more discontent. Around the world, as Todd said, when revolutions happen is when food costs become unmanageable. That was an issue in the Arab Spring. That was an issue in the French Revolution. So that was an issue in the Russian Revolution. Now, I don't know that food costs are going to become so bad that people are going to start having bread riots and that kind of stuff. But yeah, the more people are unable to meet basic necessities like food and shelter, the more that there's going to be discontent. And then parallel to that, I think that within the political system, we're going to continue to see more conflict. The next big thing that could happen is if the Justice Department actually indicts Donald Trump for criminal offenses. I think that's really going to set off a lot of things. Also, within the Republican Party now, they seem to be self-cannibalizing in a lot of ways. Like I've noticed that the Trump and anti-Trump people are really turning on each other, and then some Trump people are defecting, and then you have the DeSantis versus Trump people. And I look for the 2024 primaries, Republican primaries, to be a mess because of that. The interesting thing about Biden is that even though he has such low approval ratings, I think that a lot of partisan Democrats look at it like Biden is not really the guy running the show, so we can tolerate that. I think they look at it like, well, because they have that slogan, vote blue no matter who, which basically means, vote for a dead guy, vote for an Alzheimer's patient, vote for a guy that had a debilitating stroke, vote for Dianne Weinstein, who's, another dementia patient.
Yeah, vote for Robert E. Lee if they tell you to.
Right, exactly. Well, I think what they care about is they don't care how big a mess the individual is. They just want the policies. Well, you have that on the Republican side too. You have people who say that, well, Trump is a whatever, but he's our whatever. But I think that's even more intense on the Democratic side. I think they just look at it like it doesn't matter who the individual is. They look at it like Biden might be a dementia patient, but hey, he's not really the one running the show. So as long as it's our team running the show, even if they're de facto regents or whatever, it doesn't matter. We're still winning. So I think that's probably going to be the norm on that side of the fence for a while. If I think another issue, as far as some of these other culture war issues, I could see some of that intensifying to the point of becoming increasingly violent. Like there was this incident in North Carolina recently where somebody supposedly shot up or deactivated a power grid or something like that, and they think it may have been in response. It may have been some kind of protest about one of these drag queen, child drag queen story hours or something like that. But when I read about that, I was thinking that's the kind of stuff that actually happens in countries where they have guerrilla insurgencies. That's what they do in those countries. Like in Latin America, I read a lot about guerrilla insurgencies in Latin America where they take out that kind of infrastructure for the purpose of disruption. So it's possible we could see more stuff like that.
All right, Swithun Dobson, 2023 predictions.
Economically speaking, a recession would seem likely. As to how severe it would be is not obvious, because what is actually handy in certain respects is that for business, workers are essentially a lot cheaper in real terms because of the inflation rate. And so now, obviously, they need the revenues to go up as well. But it seems pretty easy for the real wages to go down. I mean, interestingly, if you look after the 2008 recession, in the UK, it only started sort of getting full employment, inverted commas, once the real wage rate had collapsed significantly. And once it hits rock bottom, then the unemployment figures basically go down quite a lot. Now, whether that will happen pretty quickly, I don't know. I don't think the price inflation will get much higher in its rate than it is at present. I mean, I think I said before, it might hit 20 at some point, but I don't think it'll go any higher. And I think it'll probably go down relatively quickly. You've had the spike from the Russian stuff. A lot of the post-lockdown spending has taken place. So that new money that was created has sort of moved through the system. So I do think real wages will continue to take hit for a while. But if you look at sort of the price inflation, I think from like I don't know, November 2022 to 2023, I don't think it will be as high as it was for this year, just because of the level from which it will increase. Now, real wages won't go up by very much in nominal terms, in money terms. So everyone will get poorer. The interesting thing, economically speaking, is, as Keith mentioned with respect to the interest rates, is how high they go and how much it affects house prices. Historically, yes, it's the case that food prices have caused revolutions and insurrections, but that was probably because it was the biggest proportion of their expenditure. Whereas now in the West, that's housing. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, whether there's an increase in repossessions, etc. Again, that could cause some more interesting financial collapsing. I mean, that's the big difference between 2020 and 2008, is the banks were, no one really thought the banks were particularly at risk of going under or anything like that in 2020, unlike 2008. So my prediction going forward is, yes, economically will get worse. There probably will be a recession. Everyone, let's not forget that we had the biggest recession in 2020. Everyone seems to forget that. Oh yeah, we already had a massive one. GDP fell by nearly 10% in UK, which is the biggest since 1707, I think. So I think the economic outlook will be, people will continue to get poorer, but I don't necessarily think you're going to, at least at this point, going to get a huge collapse in living standards. It will be a grinding down over the year, and also in the UK as well, possibly more so than the US. I made reference as well with the Albanians. In the UK last year, I don't remember what month it was, we had the record in immigration figures of a net over 500,000 people. And actually, if you look at just immigration, it was over 1 million. There was this year some inter-ethnic, inter-ethnic and religious conflict in Leicester between some young men from Hindu and faith and the Muslims. So, especially again, if living standards continue to grind down, then these sort of historic conflicts could well take place. Also, as well, Leicester, interestingly, is now Leicester is no longer a majority white city. There are a few others as well around. So going forward, in England at least, I think, especially when the economic situation gets worse, these sorts of the traditional inter-ethnic conflicts will flare. Especially if you've got young men who are unemployed, which is undoubtedly likely.
All right, terminal philosophy predictions for 2023.
Oh, sorry about that. Well, in regards to Ukraine, Keith brought up an interesting point where I think you said that you predict a war of stagnation, something perhaps, similar to that of Vietnam or Afghanistan, where the conflict drags out. And I could definitely see that happening. However, there, there are simply a lot of factors at play in regards to Russia. For one, the territory that they've captured in the Kherson province, they are the Russians are very, very close, geographically speaking, to making Ukraine a landlocked nation. The last major port that the Ukrainians hold is Odessa, and that is historically a Russian city since approximately the 1730s. That's just a quick side tangent on the sort of demographic ethnicity side of things, but or the nationality side of things. But if Ukraine loses Odessa, that could spell serious trouble for the Ukrainian economy, because if they no longer have sea access, that could mean all sorts of horrible things for certain nations in Africa, and as well as the domestic economy of Ukraine. So, and another thing is that it's all but certain that a number of Russian offensives are on the way, whether that's in the winter or in the spring. I think once the reservists are trained up and they're dispersed throughout the front line in somewhat of an even way, if the Russians are able to deal a series of if they're able to create enough losses on the Ukrainian side, that may in fact motivate the Ukrainians to a negotiated settlement. Now, with the territory that's held right now by the Russians, arguably the Ukrainians should be thinking about negotiated settlements now, so that they have some type of territorial leverage to perhaps get back port cities like Mariupol or parts of Kherson. I think it's all but a pipe dream. They're never going to get Crimea back. That's just that's not going to happen. And I think that given how many Russian military assets are in Luhansk and Donetsk, it would be too much of a meat grinder to just send tens of thousands of men to try and recapture all of that territory. I just don't think that's going to happen. So my prediction for Ukraine is that in 2023 to the beginning of 2024, I believe that Ukraine will actually enter a negotiated settlement. That's not to spite Keith, of course, but I think if enough losses are sustained on the Ukrainian side and they have no offensive initiative, and as well, if the cruise missile attacks from Russia continue on all these critical pieces of infrastructure and war industry, then Ukraine will simply not have the steam to sustain armored and air offensives, and that would probably motivate them to a negotiated settlement. The thing is that you can't. It would be bad for Zelensky and the government in Kiev to all of a sudden give up when they've lost everything west or east of the Dnieper River, and now all these armored divisions are right on Kiev's doorstep, and they say, okay, we want to negotiate, we want this, and this back. You're in a stronger position now to negotiate land back. So again, that's my prediction for Ukraine. I believe that there will be a negotiated settlement sometime in 2023 or early 2024. With regards to global economics, I'm very much in line with everyone else. There will be continued economic stagnation globally. I think fuel, groceries, housing, cars, electronics, they will either stay at their currently expensive prices, or they'll become slightly more expensive. We'll have to see what the repercussions are of the U.S. If the Fed increases interest rates, we'll have to see if that can actually thwart this inflation. And then my third prediction is that there will be both very serious immigration and energy crises in Europe and in the United States. I feel like there's enough on the radar to feel comfortable to make that prediction.
All right. The last thing on the agenda here is a super chat from Ricardo Williams for $4.99 US. Thank you. The DR is scared of winning. First they disavow Ye. Now they cower when Elon suspends a couple of MSM journalists for doxing. Tired of these losers. Well, any one of these could be another hour-long discussion, so I'll just limit this to a brief response that, yeah, there's a lot of people that they talk tough when it looks good, but when the chips are down, they like Homer Simpson, they back into the hedgerow. So let's have 1 minute response to Ricardo Williams. Keith.
Well, yeah, I don't know that the dissident right is a real movement. Um, it just strikes me as more of an internet subculture. It's kind of like you know gamers or something like that. It's and I mean it's not just the dissident right. I mean you find sectors of the left that are like this as well. But it seems to be a way of simply being transgressive without really doing anything much except LARPing on the internet. That's just the impression I get of it. So, I mean, if they're scared of winning, they don't have anything to be scared of because they're not going to win. So.
Okay, Swithun, 1 minute response.
The radical right and dissident right seem to be more concerned about getting more views than each other rather than actually winning anything. You have this problem as well with the Tories doing badly in the UK. A lot of these sort of smaller parties, you think they might rally around to try and get extra votes to try and get some influence, assuming that democracy can influence anything in any meaningful sense. But they don't. They just splinter, and it's just a way of jostling for sort of social status in the little corner of the world that they exist in.
Okay, terminal philosophy, 1 minute response.
Right. Well, yeah, that's an interesting comment. I think that the phenomenon of the dissident right in 2016 with Trump, I think it was initially a really fun and explosive thing where, a lot of fun memes were created from it and a lot of transgression was created from it. And, militarily, as a military analogy, I think a beachhead was established for a type of quasi-political movement, but there was never a grand strategy to create an alternative to the Republican Party, the sort of milquetoast, Mitch McConnell, Sean Hannity style of conservatism. I think the early scene of the alt-right was really interesting and something that I considered myself sort of a part of because a lot of interesting essays were being published and a lot of ideas, just people were exploring serious alternatives to the Republican Party. And that seemed to be a really interesting thing in 2014, 2015, things like that. So, but now it's just kind of a, it's a meme that the dissident right is sort of a meme unto itself. I think there's a small, tiny niche like reading class of the dissident right, but they are. I don't know. I think since Charlottesville, it was a massive PR disaster, and I think they'll be dormant for a while until conditions change nationally and globally.
All right, everyone. Thanks again, Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, Terminal Philosophy. This is Todd Lewis of the Prison Flight Podcast, signing off.